I just wanted to start to hear, like, I was looking at your press kit and like seeing all your work, and it sounds like you were very deep into the community. Can you just tell me about like what that journey has been like for you?
Sure. So I started advocating for sickle cell probably immediately when I found out that I was a trait carrier. And I didn't find out that I carried the sickle cell trait until I was like 20 weeks pregnant.
Mm.
And I was pregnant with twins. And I had never really thought about the sickle cell trait. It wasn't something that came up in my family. I'm actually the youngest of five children. And it turns out that out of all of the children, I am the only one who has the sickle cell trait. And so, sickle cell, of course, we know of it as a predominant illness in the Black community, but it wasn't something that I knew of anyone in my family ever having. So, I mentioned that I found out when I was pregnant. So, when you are pregnant and you go get care, the doctor will also ask to test your partner or your spouse or, the other person.
Mhm.
And so they tested my husband as well. And it turns out he also had the sickle cell trait. Now, he didn't know either. so um, it's kind of weird because he is one of three children, and he is also the only one out of all of his siblings who has the sickle cell trait. And so in that appointment, I found out that there was a 25% chance of us having a child with sickle cell disease. So, because I was pregnant with twins, both of my children had a 25% chance of having sickle cell disease. So they say 1 in 4 pregnancies, but because you get 23 chromosomes from each parent, and our children are actually fraternal twins, so only one of my twins actually has sickle cell, and she has sickle cell SS, which means that she inherited the S trait, which is the sickle cell trait, from me, and also the S trait, which is the sickle cell trait, again, from my husband. And so here in America, and a common name that people know SS as is sickle cell anemia. So a lot of times people are like, well, what's the difference between sickle cell disease and sickle cell anemia? And there actually is a difference. So what I learned, once I found out that I was a trait carrier, I started researching and learning. And I learned that there's a lot of different types of sickle cell disease. It's not just sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is the predominant disorder in the Black community, so people of African ancestry, but the second largest population, so the first largest population is actually in Nigeria, who has the largest number of people with sickle cell anemia. But in India, they are the second largest population, and a lot of them have different types of sickle cell disease, like thalassemias. So when I say that there are different types of sickle cell disease, you have SS, SC, you can have SE, you can have SD. So it is so broad, and there's even more. So it's basically hemoglobin disorders. And what some people may not know is that sickle cell disease, the broad term, is actually the most common genetic disorder in the world. So that means that, we've heard about genetic disorders, but we never really considered the fact that it is a disease that predominantly affects African Americans and Black people, or African people of African descent, not just African Americans. But the fact is, it is the most prevalent, but it gets the least amount of research. And that is why I try to dedicate my time and my passions to it, because that's the only way that we can raise awareness and eradicate it. Because, if two people who are getting together know that, these are things that are in their genes, they can make informed decisions. And I think that's why I speak up and I try to speak out, because you want to go into, relationships and parenting with the knowledge of, what could happen. And you want to be able to be in front of that and not really on the back end trying to catch up like I did. So I don't want anybody to be blindsided like I was.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. That was such a loaded response, but in a great way. I didn't realize that that the SS comes from the different parents and their genes. So what does it look like for, you mentioned like SC, SD? What is the difference for those types?
So for all of them, what we kind of call a pain crisis is probably the most prevalent and talked about complication, but there are a lot of different complications. So sickle cell is basically when the hemoglobin gene is mutated. So hemoglobin is actually the protein in your blood. And so when it is not, it causes the different shapes. So people with sickle cell, instead of their blood being circular, like a donut, as we say, like to explain it to children, it's kind of sickled, and it looks like a banana or a crescent moon. Those are kind of the images that we use to kind of describe what it looks like. But what happens in the body is your red blood cells, which is what is the type of blood cells that are affected, it actually they can clump together. And when they stick together and become hard and sticky, they don't flow through the body like they're supposed to. And we know that every organ and all of our body, we all need blood. And
Mhm.
so if your red blood cells carry oxygen. And so when your body isn't getting the oxygen it needs, it can cause a stroke, it can cause leg ulcers, blood clots, it can cause, retinal eye damage, just a lot of different complications. So what happens is people with sickle cell, that's kind of like the broad illness that's going on, but there are so many sub complications because your blood can pretty much affect anything, anywhere. And so that can cause a lot of different other types of problems as well. And so that's kind of like the broad answer to what's happening. But it was once believed that SC and SD and SE were so rare. And thalassemias, so there's different types of thalassemias. There's alpha, gamma, beta, it's so diverse. And so what happens is doctors are really learning more as, we speak up, as more funding, they're really doing more research and seeing that it's so much more complex than just a Black disease as we have kind of considered it in the past. And so what happens is in the past, they thought that only people with SS, sickle cell anemia, had the major problems. But it turns out that all of those other different types of sickle cell disease patients, they can also have the major complications too, because again, it's a blood disorder. And so it doesn't only affect Black people. It is believed that the mutation started because of malaria. So in countries that have malaria is a common problem, the mutation was considered, like a protection against malaria. But when two people who had that same mutation, when they procreate, it actually doesn't protect. So if a person has sickle cell disease, they're not protected from malaria, and it actually can make it worse. But if somebody has the sickle cell trait, it does make it harder for them to get malaria. And so in countries in subtropic regions where malaria is common, those are the places where you do see more of a dominance of different types of sickle cell diseases. So that's really, again, a broad answer to what it is. But yes, all of those different types of sickle cell diseases can have complications. And so we shouldn't look at SS or one type being worse than the others, because sometimes people are like, well, you only have SC. No, that is very complex. And, because we're just humans who go through so many different environmental things, you never know what can interface with that and cause the complications to be a lot worse.
Gotcha. And you mentioned that you and your husband both had the traits. Did you guys ever have any complications?
So with the trait, generally people aren't, they may not have complications. I did not know I was having complications because I did not know I had the trait. But I did a term in AmeriCorps, which is kind of like the Peace Corps, but it's here in America. And I was stationed in Denver, Colorado, which is known as the Mile High City. And so one of the things that research has told us is that when you're in a high altitude, you are more susceptible of having complications if you have the trait. And so I would get immense pain, and I was having complications, and I would go to the doctor and I'd be like, I don't know what's wrong with me. And I really didn't. And nobody tested me for sickle cell trait. And we never had this conversation. I was just given like painkillers and told to, de-stress. So I now know what was going on. When you are in higher altitudes, you need to drink more fluids and more hydration. And because I was also doing athletic work and in just extreme conditions, I was also in Montana at one point on an Indian reservation. And so I was just facing all these different types of things, and my body was reacting. I now know that it's the trait, but that's because, when you do that research and you find out about high altitudes, you find out about avoiding extreme weather, you find out about muscle exertion from exercise. So, I would say people who have heard about like athletes and athletes with the sickle cell trait who are exercising, especially, when they are maybe football players, are basketball players, and they're exercising so much and not taking breaks and getting water, that's when we hear sometimes of fatalities and things in people with sickle cell trait. So it's definitely a factor. And my husband has never had any issues as far as he knows, but for me, when I was at high altitudes or doing a lot of physical work, I did definitely notice complications.
Gotcha. And your daughter who has sickle cell, does she have the complications, or does she have any complications currently?
So she does have sickle cell disease.
Okay.
So
So it's more than
she's had a pain crisis. I'm very blessed that she doesn't have a lot of pain crisis. But I will say when she had her first pain crisis, she was actually 5 years old. And it was so scary to see because as a parent, I know what pain is really from childbirth, you know, um, that whole experience, but seeing her in pain, it wasn't even comparable to that. Her body was pulsating and she was crying continuously for days. So you may think of pain as something that's acute, that, comes and goes, like in hours and things like that. But with sickle cell, it can last for months. Like there are people with sickle cell disease who have chronic pain that never stops. And so right now we hear about like the opioid crisis because a lot of the medicine that is used to treat patients with sickle cell disease are opioids. It's pain medication to help them just to get through and make it. And so, people are learning more about how they can better treat it. I want to say since 2020, for the first time ever, there are more medications and more treatments for sickle cell disease. So at first, like when my daughter was born, it was just one medication. And so it wasn't until last year that there are now four. So, with this being the most common genetic disorder, I would love to see progress more than four.
Yeah.
I would love to see greater progress, but it's definitely a start. And so I am happy that we are making gains, but we need to make a lot more. So yes, she does have complications like fatigue. It can affect your emotional health. It can affect just how much you can exercise. So we are a family that loves exercising, loves being outdoors, but we have to kind of limit. Like if it's a really hot day, we have to make sure she has water, or sometimes we'll have to go in. If she's been out too long, like swimming, we have to watch and make sure the temperature is not too cold or not, too hot. We have to be very careful with different temperatures and just pay attention to how she's dressed, make sure that we take layers whenever we go somewhere. Like we have to kind of carry a kit because you never know when something could happen. It's kind of that unpredictable disease. So sometimes like people who have friends with sickle cell, you may be like, well, yesterday you were okay. And today they could be in the hospital fighting for their life. Like it can change in an instant. And so it's not something that we can definitely try to control it and prevent it. For my daughter, we do, she's been a vegetarian since birth. We do a lot with diet and things like that. But, it is unpredictable. But there are some things that can trigger it. And those are the things you have to prevent and watch out for.
Okay, awesome. Did her diagnosis influence your decision for homeschooling?
100%. So, actually, I wasn't going to homeschool. I loved school growing up, and I was excited to, be like, one day my kids are going to be able to go to school, and I'll be able to get back to work, get back to my career and things like that. But when I was in one of my daughter's primary care appointments, the physician, she said to me, she said, have you considered homeschooling? Because that might be the best option for your family. And I said, well, I haven't considered it, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to keep my daughter healthy. And that is probably one of the reasons that she hasn't had a lot of crisis, because she hasn't necessarily been in an environment where she's been exposed to a lot of germs, because, like getting sick, like colds and fevers and the flu and things like that, they can really make sickle cell complications worse because your body is trying hard to fight off illnesses. So your white blood cells help you fight infection. And so if you have a quick turnover of red blood cells, all of those things work together. And so what happens is, when your body has a compromised immune system, like sickle cell patients, it can really cause a lot of issues. And so we've been trying to keep her healthy, and thankfully, she's been doing well.
Awesome. I'm so glad to hear that. And for just to clarify, are the white blood cells sickled as well, or just the
So
red?
just the red blood cells. But what happens, and this is really new information, doctors have realized that when a person has a pain crisis, it's not just the red blood cells that clump together and cause that pain crisis. We have 3 different types of blood cells, so all of them are getting stuck together when in the body. And so although it is just the red blood cells, they're learning that it affects all of the blood cells just because of how the body works together and the mechanics of it all. And so it's not like you can just separate these components because they're all made to work together.
Gotcha, makes sense. So you're kind of in a unique situation where you have 2 daughters of the same age, them being twins. How does that impact parenting for, only one daughter having sickle cell?
It's a tricky thing, because if you have a child that requires special attention, special medication, you have a lot of doctor's appointments, because they have to kind of make sure that your body is staying healthy. And one of the things that doctors do, they also do something called a TCD, which is a transcranial Doppler test, and that's to test the blood flow in the brain to see if your child is at risk for a stroke. So you as a parent, all of these risks exist, and so you can be overprotective. And so when you have more than one child, you don't want to seem like you're protecting one more than the other, and you kind of have to find a balanced approach. But you also don't want your other kids to feel like they're less, like you're giving them less attention.
Right.
And so it's important to, I haven't done it as much as I would like, but like to go on dates and go on activities with each of your children separately, so that you are making up for that time and you're doing things with both of them. My other daughter has sickle cell trait. And so I also have to make sure that she's, eating healthy, taking in lots of fluids, because fluids is key. Like water is just a huge part of our lives. And so I'm definitely trying to figure it out. These are my only kids, so I'm by no means a parenting expert, but we try to do the best we can to give both of our children the same amount of love and attention and care. But it definitely is a tricky thing because children with special health needs and health challenges, a lot is required of you as a parent.
Absolutely. And I guess for your daughter's side, both of them, at what age did they know kind of what was going on in terms of having the trait and what that meant for them?
So, in my kids started reading very early, and so I would talk to them. I'm a communicator, and so I would explain things. But also, when I chose doctors and a healthcare team that would talk to us as a family, which means that. When we would go to appointments, it would be me, my husband, and my kids. Now that they're older, my husband isn't able to go as much as he was when they were little, but when they were really little, it was all four of us together, getting the information and learning together. And so the doctor wouldn't only talk to us as parents, they would also talk to both of my girls and explain things to them. And so I really encourage that because, I don't know if it'll be my kids who come up with a cure or things like that. You just have to plant seeds while they're young to learn and gain information. So I've always been open about this is what exists, not to scare them, but to explain things because I think with knowledge, you're less fearful of what is to come. And so that's really the approach that I've taken. My kids aren't necessarily visible advocates, but they definitely they learn and they try to explain it to other people when given an opportunity because they go to summer camp. That's kind of when I try to, give them that time to, just be a kid and enjoy. Because one of the things that I've learned from other sickle cell patients is you don't want to restrict your kid. You don't want to make them feel different. You want to let them do what other kids are doing within reason. And so I try to just let them be a kid and homeschooling is already different. So when I can, I try to let them just be free. And I have learned that my kids will explain it to other people, more so if I'm not around, because they'll just expect me to do it if I am around. But I love that they have been listening and they're taking into consideration what other people may not know. So they definitely have a sensitivity to it. And, it's a journey. Because just as we're learning new information, so are healthcare professionals and the medical teams. So it's not like, we've already got this thing and everything is understood. It's something that is evolving as they grow. And I love to see an article or something and say, hey, this is what, just happened. We debate as a family, we talk about different things. Are there different ways to look at it? And so I think it's just planting seeds because you never know what the future holds.
Awesome. That sounds wonderful. In terms of like identity for your kids, do they just based on what you've seen as a parent, do they feel like they're different? Do they feel like what does it look like to live in the world with the sickle cell trait and or the sickle cell disease as a child?
So I can't, I think my kids do feel different because I think every child is just a part of growing up. One of the growing pains in life is that you feel different from other people. It's like, well, where do I fit in? It's trying to find a sense of belonging, a sense of connection. And so they're not different in that regard. They're still trying to find their way. And so I think also just having a parent who is a visible advocate, that also makes them feel different because it's like, oh, mommy's out there doing this. And people are like, oh, you're so-and-so's kid, or, that they definitely get that. And so I think that's different. So I think, yes, my kids definitely feel different. I wish they would feel, just like all other kids. And I think in some ways they totally do. But I think that it's just something that they're going to grow into and really learn to accept.
Awesome. Now, you've been working with St. Jude's, and you recently had your book going to be featured at the Children's Hospital in DC, correct? In that work, do you have any idea of why we're not testing for sickle cell trait, before, pregnancy so that people can find out earlier?
So I don't know that. I think in some places they are. So like in Africa, people will be like, "Oh, you know your genotype." Like they'll just ask people, "What's your genotype?" And of course, that's a whole continent. So, different countries, I'm sure it differs. But I find that my friends who are of African descent that are straight from the continent, they tend to have a better grasp of what's your genotype. Honestly, I had never heard of that question here in the United States. I don't know about you. Have you ever
I
heard anybody say that?
know.
So here's the thing. Um, Back when the Black Panthers were really getting started, one of their big initiatives was testing for sickle cell trait. And so that was something that they really rallied around. And we know that, history tells us they were kind of shut out.
Mhm.
And so that's just one of the good community works that they did. And so, like in the 60s and 70s, people did know. But now I was born in the 80s and people didn't know. I had no idea. Now, though, in 2006, in the United States, all newborns, regardless of race, are tested for sickle cell trait. So now parents are told whether or not their child is a trait carrier. But prior to that, and depending on what state you lived in, you did not know. And so people who are, adults now, you kind of have to go to your doctors and ask. So it's up to us to have that awareness that, hey, we should be tested. And then, not all states. So when I got married, we weren't required to do genetic counseling before marriage, but some states do require that. So there are some people who know because they were in a state that required it.
Oh, okay. So I don't know if this is in capacity of your work, but is that a capacity to try to get other states or people to be able to take that testing as adults?
So I personally, I tell people, that's one of the reasons why I advocate is to tell people, hey, do you know your trait status?
Mhm.
And different PSAs, different creative ways to ask that. September is Sickle Cell Awareness Month, so you'll see a lot of different conversations about it. In athletes, they are tested. So, like in the NFL, they're tested because it can cause complications. In the military, they also are tested because in the military, when you're going through basic training, you can face exertion, and that can have a negative impact on sickle cell trait carriers. And so they like to know ahead of time. So there are different people who focus just on sickle cell trait. So there is a foundation called the As One Foundation, and they just focus on sickle cell trait. What's your status is a term that there is a gentleman who he does a lot of PSAs all about the trait. He was in the military and he had the trait and he faced complications. So that's really one of his work. So there are different people who are doing the work. There are some athletes like Ryan Clark. He's an athlete who talks about sickle cell trait. Geno Atkins is another athlete who talks about having sickle cell trait. So you will find people who definitely talk about it and who are aware of it and try to raise awareness, but it's not as prevalent as it should be because on mainstream TV, I've never seen a commercial like, do you know your genotype? And so I would like to get to that point. There's also Generation S is a movement that Jordan Sparks actually partnered with that organization to share that movement because Jordan Sparks had I don't know if it's her half sister or her stepsister who had sickle cell, and she unfortunately passed away from it. So that is one of the things that she does to help gain awareness. There's also like other celebrities who help gain awareness, like Kiki from what is that show? The Apollo,
Mhm.
who she is a big sickle cell trait and sickle cell disease advocate. And we know T-Boz. T-Boz has talked about her struggle with sickle cell disease. And so Lorenz Tate had a foundation. I don't know if the foundation still exists. He does not have sickle cell trait, but he and his brothers had a family friend who had sickle cell disease and passed away. And so one of their initiatives was their foundation that would help raise awareness and talk about sickle cell trait. So those are just a few people who are trying to get the word out, but we have to do it as a community. It has to be collective. And as people of color, we have to recognize that this is something that is in our genes. It's in our blood. We shouldn't be ashamed of it. We should just be informed and talk about it at our family reunions, at our events. It's something that we have to kind of educate ourselves on so that we make a difference and the quality of life for those who have the disease and those who have the trait better. And the only way we can do that is stop shying away from talking about it and say, hey, this exists, so let's communicate.
Absolutely, absolutely. Is it currently considered a disability?
It is because it can be fatal, and it can affect all different parts of your body. So it's definitely considered a disability. It falls in the rare disease category, but in the world there are over 205 million. I hope so the statistics I may have to check on, but last I checked, it was 205 million people have sickle cell trait. So that's really about 5% of the population, and 5% of the population, that number is from the CDC. And so it's something that exists and that we know exists. And so if we don't get ahead of it, just because of how it's passed on through our genes, that number can explode. I really would like to see the number lessen just because people are aware, hey, I have sickle cell trait. And so what was happening though, when people were getting tested, at first they were testing just for the S trait.
Mhm.
So I talked about the different types of sickle cell disease. They were always testing like the C, the E, the D. And so what's happening is people do have different hemoglobin um, genetic disorders,
Mhm.
and different traits, but they didn't realize that if somebody with the S trait got with somebody with the C trait, so what was happening is we have all of these other mutations that have formed because they weren't testing for all the different types of trait and thalassemias that exist. And so now that more knowledge is being provided to the community, I think people are now more aware. But there are some people who have thalassemia and aren't aware because maybe they don't have, sickle beta thalassemia, which is a sickle cell disease. Maybe they just have, the trait. But if they're not tested, they're not aware. So
Okay.
you have to actually ask for
Mhm.
the test. And there are some doctors, so it may not be a test given at your regular primary care doctor's office because sometimes primary care doctors and family doctors don't feel comfortable doing blood tests. So you have to really get informed and ask. I know it's something that they do at the OB/GYN offices, but I know that you really have to seek out that information to get it if you don't know already.
Gotcha, gotcha. Awesome. That's very informative. I'm wondering now, like, what does it look like to, or what do you think it might look like for, I guess, for accessibility to be considered when thinking about sickle cell?
So accessibility is huge because people with sickle cell, they often get fatigue, or when I mentioned that, when they're having a crisis, they can be gone for weeks or
Mhm.
months. And people just don't understand, well, why, if you take your medicine, are you still having issues? It's just not that simple. And so they face a lot of stigma, even in the ER, because unfortunately, doctors aren't educated as well as they should be about sickle cell trait and sickle cell disease and all of the complications that surround it. And so, like when they go to the ER, they can be seen as just a drug seeker. Because I talked a little bit earlier about the pain and how they are given opioids. And a lot of, doctors are jobs and careers, they'll test and they'll be like, so you can face different things and it be just taken out of context. So with a person with sickle cell disease, they have to really advocate for themselves and have a good support group to advocate for them. And right now that we're in the pandemic, when people go to the hospital and they're in the hospital sometimes, for weeks and months at a time, they don't have their family there because of COVID, the policies are so different. You can't have a support person. Sometimes you can't have a support person in the hospital with you, and you may need that because you may be in so much pain that you can't speak up for yourself. Or you may have your regular doctor may know what is good for you, but if you are in such immense pain and you have to go to the ER, that ER doctor may not know what your history is and how much meds work for you, because sickle cell is different for every person. It's not like, oh, you have sickle cell disease, so, 1, 2, and 3 is going to happen. It can be different for every single person. And so that really complicates things and it makes it harder for there to be certain things put in place. Last year, in 2020, before the administration changed, Melania Trump actually hosted a sickle cell roundtable. And I was invited, but I didn't get a chance to go. And the roundtable talked about what can we do, what type of legislation and bills can be passed to make it better, because families with sickle cell disease, the medicines are expensive. Like there's one medication that is more than $10,000 for a 90-day supply. So there are so many different barriers that we have to try to really break down. I mentioned that there's now four medications, but they're not they're not easily accessible for everybody, depending on your insurance, because they are so expensive. So while we now have other treatments, they may not be accessible to the population that need them most. And because of all of the expenses that healthcare cost, all of the cost associated with it, some sickle cell patients are on public health care. And that can be a barrier with getting the best care. So there are different curative therapies that are being tested, like bone marrow transplants. And bone marrow transplant is a cure for some people, but it is not a cure for everybody, because when a person receives a bone marrow transplant, it can be hard to find a donor match. Last year, I partnered with Be the Match and the Sickle Cell Consortium to build that registry and gain more Black registrants for the Be the Match registry. Because right now, there's only 4% of registrants out of millions of people who are of African American descent, or who are Black people. And so that number is very small in comparison to the amount of people who need or who are waiting for a bone marrow transplant. So I would like to see that increase. And it's such a complex thing, because they are protected by the Disability Act, but it's only so much that FMLA can do if you are out for months at a time. So
Right.
it's a tricky thing. Many people with sickle cell disease are so intelligent, but because they often are in and out of the hospital, it can really affect their careers, and that can affect their mental health. And so many other things. So it's, the answer to that question is complex, but, I hope that I was able to provide just some understanding of, what we need, some changes that need to happen, and things that need to kind of take place and get better when it comes to accessibility. Because it can also affect your eyes, like it can cause retina damage. So that can have, vision consequences. So, when you can, like if you're posting things, making sure that you fill out the alt text. If people are, having to use different services that make things more accessible, that's important. And it's just so many different nuances that go into it, but those are just some of the highlights.
Awesome. Thank you. That was very informative. Things that I didn't even consider. But I guess this is why, you are doing the work that you're doing and informing us. I wanted to, since we have the World Sickle Cell Day coming up on Saturday, how would you encourage people or suggest that people honor and celebrate the day?
Oh, there are so many ways to honor the day. One of the things that is really pretty much at the top of my list is become a blood donor. And I say that with a smile because I just talked about the bone marrow transplant registry, but as people of color, we often have unique blood types.
Mhm.
And we need to be giving blood because people with sickle cell trait, one of the treatments is often to receive a blood transfusion. And that keeps sickle cell not trait, I'm sorry, sickle cell disease. So sickle cell disease patients need blood transfusions, many of them just to make it. And so if they do have a unique blood type, like, oh, it's hard to get the blood that they need. And so I'm asking, and there are many different blood drives. I will definitely send you some information because I know so many foundations who are running blood drives to increase the amount of blood that people can receive. So me as a person with sickle cell trait, I can donate blood, but I can't necessarily donate blood to help sickle cell disease patients,
Right.
because my blood, while some of it is normal and healthy, some of it is abnormal. And so if you have the sickle cell trait, you can still donate blood. It just will go to help somebody who doesn't have sickle cell disease. But I just advocate for people to give blood. That is one of the best and most important things that you can do, especially now during this pandemic, because a lot of people stopped going out, which meant they also stopped donating. And so sickle cell patients who are immunocompromised have never stopped needing the blood. And so definitely try to give if you can. The next thing that people can do is support a sickle cell foundation. The Sickle Cell Disease Association of America is in Baltimore, Maryland, but they are the organization that's really in charge of all of the organizations here in America. But a lot of states have their own community-based organizations. So you can look up and see what organization in your state is in need of help. You can volunteer. A lot of times they need people. One of the simplest things you can do is follow some of these organizations and reshare their content. That is some of the simplest things because they're always doing the work. Because, I'm clearly passionate about the topic, but I'm not the only one. There are thousands of people who are doing the work, and we're all, fulfilling a role. And so one of the things that we need is people just like you who are willing to amplify our voices, so that, it's not just us who know about these things, it's people all over the world. Because people are finding out who are not Black. They're like, oh my gosh, my child has sickle cell disease. And they're like, I didn't even know this was possible. And there's a lot of people of Hispanic descent, because we know that there's just tons of, just different genetics that mix. And there are a lot of Hispanic people who have sickle cell disease.
Mhm.
And so it's like, this isn't only a conversation that we need to be having in the Black community. We really just need to be speaking up, because as we mix and love who we want to love, we have children with these genetic traits, and we pass different things down to our offspring.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, I think those are wonderful ways to really highlight to celebrating the day, and I thank you for sharing those. I think it's really important. I know that you have three books, right? Are they
I
all around sickle cell or?
So yes, all three. All three are all sickle cell related. So a sickle cell coloring book was really my first book because I wanted to put out a book that parents can do with their kids because I'm an educator. I homeschool and I'm like, parents can color with their kids. It's calming, and this whole type of experience is very stressful. And when you're going to the doctor's office, sometimes you don't want to just hand your child your cell phone, which is kind of, been our recent go-to. Sometimes you want them to just be able to relax in other ways. And so a sickle cell coloring book was my first book. And I wanted families to be able to explain it. And so that's really what the book does. ABCs for sickle cell is just the children's book because people use their tablets and things like that. So there's also an ebook that is available as well as a paperback print book. And it's in the libraries because it is information that people should be getting. And so there's a lot of sickle cell literature. So, grabbing sickle cell literature and learning about it is another way to support and, requesting it in your local libraries. That's something very simple that you can do. But also in my books, my last book is for preteens and teens because as children grow, I talked about you need somebody to advocate for you and you need a support group. And what happens is in our medical system, when a person reaches, a certain age, their parents aren't given as much knowledge about what's going on with their child. And that really makes things very complex for sickle cell patients because they sometimes are unable to speak up for themselves if they are in the midst of a crisis or in the midst of something that can just kind of change their whole world. And so their parents are a good friend or a good family member or just whoever their support person is may need to be right along speaking up for them and letting people know what's happening. And so with my book, the Ultimate Sickle Cell Activity Book, just like I'm explaining this information in conversation, I've really put that information in the book through puzzles and the way I wanted my children to learn it. And I really wrote the book for my kids. Like every single book, I write it to teach my kids because I'm a writer. This is how I explain the best. And so I was like, well, I don't only have to provide this for my children, it can be for all children. And so that is what the third book does. It gives, and it really, anybody of any age can do the activities because it just goes through each and every different aspect of sickle cell disease. So there's 10 different chapters, sections. They're not really chapters because it's activities in between. And it explains how sickle cell works through the body. It starts with sickle cell trait, and it talks about the complications and goes on through. It talks about mental health. It talks about treatments and just a variety of different things. It talks about blood because I think that's the foundation of it all. You got to understand blood and how it works. And so what my hope is that people will read my books and gain a level of understanding to want to learn more, to want to talk to their doctors and see, is this something that, can affect my family, my future family, and different things like that. And I also hope that there will be more hematologists. So I haven't actually touched on this, but there is a shortage of adult hematologists, people who treat adult patients. So there are people who have a sensitivity to children and pediatric patients. And so often the care that pediatric patients get is so comprehensive and is done with a smile, and the patients are treated, like small heroes, which is good because they are. But when they become adults, is kind of flipped, and the stigma starts. They become isolated, stigmatized, victimized, and just mistreated. And so what I hope is that, if people start learning about it, just the foundation of it, they will develop a sensitivity to it. But, we need more people, especially doctors of color, doctors of African descent, and just, anybody can have a sensitivity to it and to others and empathy for it. But, often when we get medical treatment, it's different when the person looks like you. And so I definitely would love to see more doctors of color who specialize in hematology and in adult hematology, and adult hematology with an emphasis in sickle cell disease. So that's very specific, but I'm putting that call to action out there. Become an adult hematologist, people.
Mhm.
So, those are just some of the reasons why I wrote the book. I wanted to make sure. So if you look in the images, it's diverse, because when I have gone out and I've shared my story as a caregiver, my audience has been diverse.
Mhm.
And it was my audience who said, we need something tangible. We want to learn more. We want to hear more. And so that's why I took the stories and the lessons that I share with my children and made it available. And so my books are diverse, but I was very intentional about also including images of medical professionals who look like us. And the book is very intentional about that and reflective of, different diversity, not just in physical appearance, ethnicities, but also in different weights and just different bills, because we are a variety. We love you just differences, and so all of that needs to be celebrated. So when you look at my books, they're done with intention.
Awesome, awesome. And there was one book or is it a book or is it a pamphlet that's going to be used at the Children's Hospital?
So right now, my coloring book is already used in Children's National Hospital, but my new book, the Ultimate Sickle Cell Activity Book, is it's launching on World Sickle Cell Day, and that book is going to be used in the Children's National Hospital's transition program. So I'm very excited about that, and I encourage other hospitals and just different places around the world to take advantage of the resources that are out there and put these items in your hospital gift shops. Put them in, baskets. Let patients know that these resources exist so that they don't feel alone. Because what happens is when someone is diagnosed, so for us and many patients, they're just told. Sometimes they're told over the phone. We received a card that said your child has sickle cell hemoglobin SS. Keep the card with you. We got to do better than that. We have to give a more comprehensive view, so that people will know, and they'll feel educated and loved, because it's a challenge to carry, a lifelong illness. But if you're just kind of given this information without the love and empathy and a care team, then it can be a lot to carry. And so my hope is that different hospitals and nationwide will really embrace these books and embrace the materials and educate the population so that they know that the hospital staff cares, because a lot of sickle cell patients feel like hospital staff, they don't care. But I know that they do, and I know that the research is being done to make things better. And so that's why I have written the books, and I hope to write, more books and storybooks to just really take away that stigma, because we have a long way to go. And this is what I feel like my role is to the whole movement. And I think, we all have a part to play, whether it's a conversation, whether it's giving blood, do what you can to make a difference.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And where can people find and follow you, and where can they purchase your books?
So I am on all platforms. My handle is Cleverly Changing. So you can find me on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, Cleverly Changing. On Twitter, it doesn't have the G on the end, so it's Cleverly Changing. And my website is cleverlychanging.com. People can purchase my books on my website, but also on Amazon. Different I'm trying to get my books in more Black and diverse bookstores. So definitely, if you are a bookstore owner and you hear my story, definitely um, reach out. I definitely give discounts to hospitals. Um, and if you want a bulk discount for my books, you have to get the bulk discount on my website. And so that is cleverlychanging.com/shop. So that is pretty much where people can follow me. And I also have a podcast, which is a homeschool podcast to educate others. So if people want to be a guest and have a conversation with me on my podcast to educate others, because that's what I love to do, then they definitely can reach out on my site, cleverlychanging.com. So just go to cleverlychanging.com and you can learn more.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. Is there anything else you want people to know before we sign off?
Yes. So the Sickle Cell Community Consortium and Cayenne Wellness, they're having a 24-hour sickle cell event, which is amazing. So for one complete day, you can definitely immerse yourself into learning all about sickle cell disease. And what I love is partners from all over who have done so many different things. So it's not just somebody talking. It's going to be fun and lively and activities. At 2 p.m. on World Sickle Cell Day, I will be participating with Northwestern Mutual. They're doing a mini camp. And unfortunately, Geno Atkins, he was originally the football player who was going to be helping us out with the event, but we have Ryan Clark, who is going to take his place and talk about his own experiences. And I just love that you have different people who are doing different things. The mini camp is all about fun. So it's going to be knowledgeable, but it's all about having fun with kids. So if you have a kid, they may have sickle cell trait, they may have sickle cell disease, or you just want them to know about it, definitely register and sign up. So.
Awesome.
And
Awesome.
I'll forward you that information. I didn't send it yet because they sent me the update about Geno.
Mhm.
So I'm waiting for them to send me um, the new information in print and not just verbally. So I can send you that, but I can send you the registration link. And those who register for the mini camp, the attendees will get a free gift. One of the gifts is my book. So.
Awesome. Awesome. That's so beautiful. Thank you so much, Elle. I really appreciate it. This has been wonderful, and we really appreciate you sharing this knowledge, especially at African Ancestry. As we've learned that sickle cell is so prominent in our community, so it's so important.
Yeah, and I just want to say, like, the African component to it all is basically there are many countries in Africa. In the new book that I have, The Ultimate Sickle Cell, I talk about the areas where sickle cell is most prevalent, and most of those countries are in Africa. So, just off the top of my head, I'm thinking, Nigeria was number one. You had Tanzania, you have the Congo, you have so many different countries that have large populations. And when I first started when I first started doing the work, it was a lot of foundations in Africa who would reach out. There's a matter of fact, there's a girl in Africa who reached out to me because she's I can't think of what her title is, but she's in Nigeria and she won one of the pageant titles. And her platform, she has sickle cell disease and she wants to educate the school systems, but because of the stigma that exists around sickle cell in Africa, people don't want other people to know if their child has sickle cell disease, because the schools will say, well, none of the kids have sickle cell disease here, because there's still that stigma that exists. And so by raising awareness and talking about it, we can strip that stigma away. And so